Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Family and Friends update. My name is Petronila Ndebele, and I'm the Director of Strategic Communications and Stakeholder Relations, and will be facilitating today's program. Before we begin, I would like to start by giving the land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. We also acknowledge that we are all treaty peoples, including those who came here as settlers, as migrants either in this generation or in generations past, and those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. Today, we pay tribute to the ancestors of those of African and indigenous origin and descent. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment and request everyone watching this to add their voice to the 5 to Survive campaign and spread the message to your family and friends. Community Living Toronto, along with many other DS agencies, has joined hands to advocate for essential changes in the funding and support provided to the developmental services sector. We are urging the Government of Ontario for an immediate 5% increase in core funding to help meet the growing demands for our services. Funding from the government has not kept up with our operational costs. Join us in reaching the goal of 10,000 signatures. Please type hashtag 5 to Survive in your browser, and it will take you to the Community Living Ontario page. Kindly take 10 seconds and sign the petition that will reach your local MPPs and the Minister of Children, Community and Social Services, urging them to take action. Thank you so much for joining us in doing this campaign. Thank you once again, and on your screen now is our agenda for today. We are excited to celebrate the Inclusive Education Month this February and are privileged to hear from the voices that matter. Our CLTO influencers will talk about their idea and experience with inclusive education. And for our fireside chat, we are honored to welcome David Lepofsky, renowned lawyer, academic, a passionate disability rights advocate, and also a member of CLTO's Patrons Council. It is now my pleasure to call upon CLTO influencers, Farah, Jenna, and Nelson, along with Tracy, Community Inclusion and Advocate Supervisor, and Carmen, Community Engagement Coordinator at CLTO. Team, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Petty, for that introduction. So yes, today myself and the influencers and Carmen are going to talk a little bit about why Inclusive Education Month is very important to us. So I guess first we'll introduce the influencers, just for those who may not be aware of them. They are a group of people who have developmental disability and who are working very hard through social media and presentations to create awareness and positive change in their communities.
So my name is Carmen Willikoot, and as mentioned, February is Inclusive Education Month. So this is a time of which members of the community living movement and its many partners raise awareness about inclusive education and how the development of inclusive schools and inclusive school practices help to provide education to an increasingly diverse student type population, including students with an intellectual disability.
So before we talk about inclusive education, we always like to try to encourage you watching and anybody out there to remember the memories you have about school. We know that school is about learning, right? We learned our math, we learned our lessons, but it's also about celebrations. It's about graduation and doing things as a group. It's also about field trips. You think of those fun things you did when you were learning, but you had fun with your peers, right? And the lunchroom, the good old lunchroom, right? Whether it looked like this or you ate lunch in your classroom, which is what we did when I was young in elementary school, right? And playing in the playground. The reason that we want you to think about these kind of memories, because inclusive education is just more than just learning. It is about all those social and experiences that you have with others. So community schools. So what do we mean by community schools and inclusive education? Well, they're places of learning. They're places of connection. They're places of celebration. They're places of growth. So we try to remember that schools are more than just the A, B, C's. So this is, Nelson is going to give us a little bit of feeling. So each influencer talked a little bit about their school experience as we were creating these slides together. And they each came up with a message they wanted you to hear about inclusive education. So Nelson was thinking, he thought about his experience, right? And Nelson's always so great at coming up with these one-line quotes that are so amazing. And what Nelson wanted us to write down here is, inclusive education is the smartest way to go.
It's the smartest way to go, and it's the only way to go. If you exclude us, you're not giving us time to be part of the group, to be part of the group. So
yeah, Nelson really wanted people to know that, you know, inclusive education is about treating people as equals.
yeah.
Right? Yeah. And now we're going to hear from Jenna. Jenna wanted to share her message about inclusive education.
Inclusive education fosters social connections, essential for all children, and creates supportive communities within schools.
Yeah, and the reason this quote is very important, Jenna, if I can just continue and share your story. Jenna was part of the inclusive education campaign many, many years ago. And one of the highlights in her campaign was, we actually still have the old posters around, was talking about the time when she was invited to a birthday party, showing that the connections that one makes at school, because Jenna attended the regular class in an inclusive setting, they extended beyond just the classroom. And so it was really important for Jenna to share that. Thanks, Jenna. And now Farah would like to share her thoughts about inclusive education.
Yeah. Self-embrace for diversity by recognizing and valuing each child's unique talents and abilities.
Thank you so much, Farah.
Yeah.
And Josh couldn't be here with us today, but I believe Jenna is going to help us out with this.
Inclusive education also works because it teaches other kids that it is okay to be different.
Yeah, there's effect. Inclusive education doesn't only affect those that identify as having a disability. It does have an effect on the other, what we call neurotypical children in the classroom as well. And so this is, while we were preparing what we were going to say today, Carmen, who always supports the influencers whenever we're doing our planning, talked a little bit about a story that she had as a neurotypical person at school. And so we all thought the influencers wanted her to share her story. So I'll leave it to Carmen to tell her story.
Thank you, Tracy. So as you can see on the screen, the quote says that there is no downside to inclusion. And what I mean by this is that it's often thought that inclusive classrooms will take away from the neurotypical class, but it doesn't. Inclusion actually changes lives. So when I think about inclusive education, I think about my own personal experience, as do many. And as someone who was always in a neurotypical or regular classroom, I feel I was very lucky in terms of who and what I was exposed to. So from an early age, it was just kind of understood that not everyone learns the same, nor will they learn at the same rate for that matter. So when I think back to middle school and even elementary school, there are a number of individuals that had different abilities who were a part of our regular classroom. And yes, when it came time for things like testing, they needed additional supports like extra time, but they were never singled out, as other students also needed these accommodations, like those who maybe had English as a second language or were having trouble in school for a variety of reasons. And although we were never in the same homeroom or we had the same lunch period, we passed each other's in halls, attended assemblies and events together, and I knew their name and they knew mine because we were peers at the end of the day. But more importantly, I think about Miss Paquette and my grade 10 drama class. So Miss Paquette didn't just teach drama, she taught kindness, acceptance, belonging, and inclusivity, which are all really big and important things for a teenager to be learning. It was a safe space for a lot of students inside and during class. Inside and during class as well as outside class. But this was also extended to David, who was a nonverbal individual with cerebral palsy, who Miss Paquette would walk down the hall every day and bring into our class. There was actually a permanent space for him in his chair at the front of our semicircle that we sat in at the front of the stage, where he was able to easily move around the class without needing to rearrange chairs or anything. So Miss Paquette led by example in showing us how to include David in activities and productions without ever actually telling us the specifics of his disability. In fact, when I was 15, I actually couldn't tell you what cerebral palsy was, but I knew that David loved to give high fives and that his smile was contagious and his giggles meant that an idea might be extra fun or silly. And though it was rare, a thumbs down did mean that we were going back to the drawing board with our ideas. In some, we learned to communicate with David because he was our fellow peer. And I look at the work I do now and the individuals I currently support, and thinking back to these experiences and the Davids and Lisas and Austins that I had the pleasure and opportunity to know while growing up. And I think it's safe to say that they successfully changed and impacted my life. And I hope that the same holds true for them. But thank you for letting me share my story.
Oh, thank you so much, Carmen. I know when you shared that story, I think all of us were speechless and some of us had tears in our eyes. So thank you so
I'm
much.
speechless now. I almost crying, and she almost cried herself. So
Yeah, it is a very moving story.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
thank you for agreeing to share it. I'm glad that the influencers asked you to share it, and thank you for sharing it.
On February 27th, we're gonna have a live Q&A session on Facebook and Instagram about exclusive education, the influencers. Stay tuned. It's gonna be a lot of fun.
And thank you so much for having us today.
Thank you so much, Tracy, Nelson, Jennifer, Joshua, Carmen, and everyone else. And I thank you for sharing your moving experiences. And it is amazing to hear about what inclusion means to you. And thank you for raising awareness about the significance of inclusive education. Indeed, we'll stay tuned on February 29th to hear the CO2 influencers talk about this important issue. So thank you so much for joining us today. And next, we have a fireside chat with a very special guest who has helped to improve accessibility in education, not only education, but his community advocates for the rights of people with disabilities. He has led him to receive the Order of Canada, the Order of Ontario, honorary doctorates from Queen's, Western, the Law Society of Ontario, Brock, and numerous other awards. Thank you for joining us today, David, and over to you, Brad.
Thanks, Patty, for that. And thanks to the influencers for talking about Inclusive Education Month. Good to see the work and their reflections on their experiences with inclusive education. It's my pleasure this afternoon to talk to David Lepofsky. David is a legend in across Canada, but especially locally in Toronto. David is a member of our Community Living Toronto Patrons Council and has been a good friend of our organization for many years. David has an extensive, I should say, welcome, David.
Great to be here.
Just a bit of background so people can to remind people around your significant background in this area. You are a lawyer by training and graduated from Osgoode Law School, as well as earning a master's degree in law at Harvard Law. You are a recipient of both the Order of Ontario and the Order of Canada. And some of your most significant work was around the Ontarians with Disabilities Act and the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act in 2005, and a founding member of the AODA Alliance, which I know we'll talk about. You are a frequent Twitter/X user, posting pretty regularly and getting lots of traffic there. Also a massive Star Trek fan, which is always good to talk to you about. You are most recently, and I think this is timely around Inclusive Education Month, the newly elected or newly re-elected chair of this Toronto District School Board's Special Education Advisory Committee. So we'll dive into a number of areas related to education, advocacy, and inclusion. David, welcome.
Great to be here as always, and always good to talk to you.
Why don't we, I'd love to hear a little bit about advocacy is sort of, I know you best in that space. How did you get drawn into this, or what has been your passion around doing advocacy for so many years? Well,
I was born with partial vision in one eye and no eyesight in the other eye. And over my teens, that vision got worse to the point where by my early 20s, I was totally blind. And I experienced barriers as a person with a disability early on and often. I went to law school, not to do disability rights, but frankly, because I wanted to be a lawyer. And I pursued a career, which I'm now retired from. I'm a part-time law teacher just in my retirement, but I pursued a career practicing law, not in the disability space, but starting over 4 decades ago, I decided that I wanted to use my advocacy training for a passion that mattered to me outside my day job, and that was doing disability rights advocacy. So that involved such things as back in 1980 to 82, I was one of the people who advocated to get disability included in the Charter of Rights and in the Ontario Human Rights Code. And I learned early on about cross-disability organizing when I was one of many working together on those goals. And I got into it because the cause matters to me, and because I'm fortunate enough to have the training to have the skills to be a lawyer. And not that I serve as lawyer for the cause. I don't. I'm an individual and I'm a private individual, but still, the training in doing persuasion is where I live. So it was trying to persuade people on something that really mattered. And one of the things I learned, Brad, early on was I as a blind person, learned initially about the barriers facing blind people. But I quickly learned that while deaf people face different barriers and people with intellectual disabilities face different barriers, and people with autism face different barriers, we actually all face the same barriers. The barrier we face is that we live in a world that's designed and operated largely for people without disabilities. We're kind of an afterthought, and we face, I mean, the manifestation of the barriers may be different, but the experience is the same. And so I learned that whichever barrier we're tackling, we need to tackle them all together.
That's great. Now, you mentioned, and I'm really curious about this, you know, sitting here in 2024, thinking back to when Canada developed the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and repatriated the Constitution, you were involved in, disability was not included in the original drafts of the Charter of Rights, and it's hard to believe, you know, 40 years plus since then that was even, was it an oversight? Was it just not thought of, or have times changed that much?
Well, we've been trying to figure that out. In fact, I've got a memoir coming out where I talk about the history of the fight to get that we all mounted to get disability into the charter. And we were trying to figure out why we were left out. It was clearly someone decided it. And the only right from, over Parliament debated the charter from 1980 to 1982 when it was passed. And there was only one right added to it during that debate that wasn't in there in the first place, and that was equality for people with disabilities. It's one of those rare examples that recurs in the disability rights movement, I think, as much or more than in any other rights movement, where we got left out and then we kind of organized and fought and we elbowed our way in. The same with getting in the Ontario Human Rights Code, same with getting the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act passed, same with getting the Accessible Canada Act passed. These are grassroots, bottoms up wins, not top down rights just handed to us by politicians.
That's great. You talk a lot. You talk, and I've experienced you this way, where advocacy for you is a very personal endeavor, but it also is important to involve people at the grassroots who are in it not as in paid positions, or you've never accepted payment for any of the advocacy work that you've done, but you're pulling groups together around a common cause to influence policy. Can you talk about that experience versus some of the other approaches that advocacy can take?
Sure. Let me tell you this. First, I believe everyone is totally entitled to and should be involved in disability advocacy. There are those of us who already have our disabilities, but there are lots of people who don't yet have a disability, but they're bound to get one eventually, because disability comes to everybody as we age. So I don't take the position that only people with disabilities can fight for this cause, because this is everybody's cause. We are the minority of everyone. Well, then, how do we get everybody active? Well, to me, some people know of me, if they know of me at all, because they may have seen quotes of me in the media or something, because the media have asked me to comment on a number of stories, or I and my coalition have been involved in taking stories to the media. But the vast majority of our success doesn't come from loudmouths like me. The vast majority comes from individuals with disabilities, family members of individuals with disabilities, who take on the individual challenges of trying to persuade a school to provide an accommodation they're not providing, trying to provide a landlord to provide housing opportunity, trying to get government to provide something that they're not but should. And it's the work of all of us together that leads to victory. So what that leads me to want to do is to help empower people. So let me give you an example. We'll talk about education.
Yeah.
We have in Ontario funded schools, there are 2 million students. At least 1/3 of them are students with disabilities. And I mean any kind of disabilities, physical, intellectual, mental health, learning, or combination, sensory disabilities. Well, every one of their families, one way or another, has to advocate for their child's needs, because the school system is primarily designed to serve students without disabilities. We're an afterthought. And too often we're kind of an underclass. They come up with fancy names like exceptionalities. We don't have exceptionalities. We have disabilities. Okay, that's what they are. And it's not just a word. My blindness doesn't make me exceptional. I should be treated on a footing of equality, whether I'm blind or I'm sighted. I shouldn't be treated like I'm exceptional, like I'm different or abnormal. The same for all kids with disabilities. So what do we do about it? Well, I learned enough from doing advocacy myself and from the experience of others. And so I recorded a video, and I'm going to provide you with a link that you can share. And it's a video with tips for parents of students with disabilities on how to advocate for your child at school. What do I do? Who do I go to? What can I do? How do I figure out what's going on? I try to provide really practical tips on what to do and how to do it. As well, you'll hear me mention that there's, under our anti-discrimination law, the Ontario Human Rights Code, school boards have a duty to accommodate students with disabilities. Well, you may have heard of that, but what on earth does it mean? Well, I recorded a video that's just an introduction for lay people of what the duty to accommodate people with disabilities means, not only in schools, but elsewhere, in jobs and whatever. So I'll provide you with those links, and I'm hoping those two tools will help individuals with disabilities and family members get some ideas of what they can ask for and how to push for it.
That's great. We've one of the previous chats that we had as part of these webinars was interviewing a parent, Laura Parsonson, talking about the experience with her daughter who was born with a disability, and how right from the first moments in the hospital, how different her journey was and how much of a struggle it was at times. For her to make sure that Emily was included in daycare centers, in community activities, and in school. That it's a struggle. And you talk about the rights that parents have, but you also point out that it can be a struggle for people to have those rights realized. The Special Education Advisory Committee is something that's a requirement of school boards. And has been around for quite a long time. Can you talk about your work with the Special Education Advisory Committee and how that would relate to parents who are starting off on this journey with raising a child with a disability, or those who might be further along in their education in high school or leaving high school going into college? Long-winded question, but maybe start off with the SEAC and the role that you see that
So it's Special Education Advisory Committee, or SEAC. I've been a member of this body for the Toronto District School Board since 2015. I was the chair for a couple of years back in 2016, 2017, and I'm now chair again for a year. These are all volunteers on this committee. They're appointed by the school board. TDSB is Canada's largest school board. We have 250,000 students. We have tens of thousands of students with disabilities. I think we may have more students with disabilities than some school boards have students in total. That's how big we are. And so what does this committee do? We are appointed under provincial law to give advice to the school board of what they need to do to better serve the needs of students with special education needs. Now, there's a few things I got to tell you right up front. We don't have the power to do anything except give advice. We don't have a right to be listened to, and certainly the school board doesn't have to listen to us. But our job is to try to give the best advice we can, and in my role as chair, to try to focus our attention on the issues that are the most important and to on the ones that will engage the interests of the diverse individuals and groups represented at the table. What we don't do, and some people don't understand this, we don't argue individual cases. So sometimes a parent who's having a battle with the school board will copy all of us on their child's case when they're writing and complaining. People are, of course, free to email us whatever they want, but we don't sit and assess individual cases and tell the school board what to do. We can't. We don't have the resources. We don't have the mandate. And frankly, we're all volunteers. So what does that mean? Well, school boards have to have a SEAC, but the question is, when can you have an impact, and can you have an impact? It's not easy because school board senior officials who come to talk to us are, I believe, well-meaning but overloaded. And their role is to manage the system as it is, and our role is to try to make it better. There are times that we have had an impact. I'm going to give you an illustration. Back in 2017, when I was chair last time, we had a lawyer from the Arch Disability Law Center come and speak to us about whatever he wanted, about issues that they hear about from parents. And if families have an issue with their school board and they can't get any progress, sometimes they have to resort to talking to legal professionals, and Arch is a community legal aid clinic. They're fantastic. Well, he came in and told us that there was a recurring problem at school boards around Ontario, not just Toronto, which is that school principals have the power to refuse to admit a student to school for all or part of the day. So you got to imagine the family wants the child to go to school, the child wants to go to school, but the principal says either you can't come at all, can't come for part of the day. Now, you should immediately think, wait a minute, are we talking about discipline? Like they're being suspended? No, this is not discipline. And then you might think, well, aren't we all supposed to have a right to an education? Yes, you do. But this seems to be a hole in that right, and a very serious one. So we went to the school, and disproportionately, this power has been used on some families of students with disabilities. Like, for example, Arch told us sometimes a school might call a parent and say, you know, your child's education assistant is sick today. We can't accommodate your child. Please pick your child up. Well, that's wrong. If the EA is away, the school board's job is to cover them. That's why we have supply lists.
Yeah.
Right. And we then turned back in 2017 to the school board and said, well, what's your policy on when you'll do this and when you won't? Well, they didn't have one. Well, we pushed for months and had long conversations, and they eventually developed one. And it was a real improvement. Now there's questions now about how many of their staff 7 years later know it or follow it. So we're still hearing from our members that too often this is happening, these exclusions from school. So we are, I can tell you, under my chair role, I am going to be putting this on the agenda and focusing attention. Now, again, we can't force the board to do anything, but we can certainly try to use our advocacy to try to put pressure and make recommendations to the trustees and so on. Now, you can follow our meetings. They may be boring for some people, but if you go to the TDSB website and you look up the Special Education Advisory Committee, our meetings are the dates are posted in advance, our agendas and so on, and they're streamed live on YouTube. So they're physically open to the public now.
That's great to know.
And so on, but still, and if a community like, for example, Community Living Toronto has a representative on our CEAC, Tracy Regan, she's fantastic as an advocate, and also she's an absolutely delightfully lovely person. Now, your community can, through your representative, your organization, can come to me as the chair and say, hey, here's a recurring issue. Can we get that on the agenda? And my job, I'm kind of an air traffic controller. What I do, because I get these requests, is try to figure out, okay, you got a problem? Let's see if we can work it out with staff without having to deal with it at a meeting. If we can work it out with the board, that's great. If not, then it's my job to try to make sure people get airtime. So that's what we do. So we don't deal with individual cases, but we're trying to look for areas where we can make improvements. I'll tell you a second one that I can tell you I'm quite committed to work on, and I think that my colleagues on the committee are too. Students with disabilities are entitled to what's called an individual education plan. That's the school board coming up with a written document that says, here's what your additional learning needs are, here's what we're prepared to do for you. Well, under the provincial regulations, the school board's supposed to consult with the family on what should be in that plan. And that's great. But the way the board, most boards do this, as far as I'm concerned, maybe all, is they just send a letter home. We're going to do an individual education plan, tell us what your child's needs are, and tell us what their strengths are, or whatever, and we'd be happy to talk to you. But what they don't do is offer to the family, why don't you come in, if you'd like, and we could have a meeting, an IEP meeting with the teacher and the principal and the school board professionals, and you can bring your professionals if you have anybody with her, and anybody you want, and let's talk together about what should be in the individual education plan. Now, parents like me who know that we can ask, and I would hope most, if not all the time, we get the meeting. And I can tell you from personal experience, it's a really helpful process. But there are lots of parents who don't know to ask. Now, any watching this, my advice to you, my recommendation, my friendly suggestion, one parent to the next, if you try to ask an IEP, or they may be developing one, ask your principal, say, I'd like to come in for an IEP meeting. You can do it in person, you can do it on Zoom. We'd like to work out together what should be in that document.
Yeah, the IEP is a really great tool that allows families to sort of track the accommodations that have been made through the duration of a student's time in school, and also can be used as a good tool for the student themselves or for parents as they go into the next year of school or move from primary school into high school. But you're right, it's a tool, but it's only as good as the plan that went in, the way effort that went into development, and the degree to which it is accommodated and used for accommodation in the classroom.
And so here's the problem. The board doesn't tell families who may not know any better that they can ask for an IEP meeting in order to collaborate on what's in the IEP. And if parents don't know to ask, they're less likely, they're probably not going to ask. So I'm going to be proposing, we have already recommended to the board, and I want to ramp up the pressure on this, that the board should notify all families in writing that they can ask for an IEP meeting. Now, why on earth would the board say no? But that's an illustration of one of the issues that at least I'm hoping we can put on the agenda.
That's great. You mentioned Tracy O'Regan, who's a longtime staff person at Community Living Toronto, and is on both the Toronto District School Board and the Catholic School Board as an SCAC advisor. So if there's anybody watching, or if in your networks people are aware of issues or themes that are recurring, please reach out to Tracy, or you can do that through our website, and she can collect those themes and start bringing them forward as she's done for years. I tend to agree, David, that I think so much of the education system, it's not that people are poorly intent. There's not bad intention or malintent behind people's sort of some of the misses that happen, but people are overwhelmed. We've seen a theme as well at times especially with students on the autism spectrum that may have challenges making it through a whole day, where they follow the spirit of the law, but not or the letter of the law, but not the spirit. So somebody might be able to come for an hour or an hour and a half in the morning and then have to go back home. And it's a way of saying, yes, they're engaged in school, but they're really not receiving an education, and there's a lot of burden on families to cover off that time of day and not giving people their full right to education.
The problem is this: the problem roots in there are two root problems in the system. One is that, as I said earlier, the system is designed essentially to serve students without disabilities, which they used to actually call normal students, believe it or not, offensive as that sounds. So students who aren't in that bandwidth, they call exceptional pupils. And that doesn't mean exceptional like Brad Saunders is an exceptional guy, even though you are an exceptional guy. But it means they're weird, they're not normal. And then they don't call them disabilities, they call them exceptionalities. So that's already bad enough. Could you imagine a workplace that said we had white employees and then we had exceptional employees? It's like, that's racist, and it would be. Why should people with disabilities be viewed any differently? So that's the first problem. The second problem is that the provincial government's outdated definition of exceptional pupils don't include, or does not include, all the disabilities that our Human Rights Code guarantees equality to.
Oh, wow, I didn't realize that.
We've gotten complaints, for example, that ADHD isn't covered. Now, some school boards will accommodate students with ADHD anyway. Others will say, well, that's not an exceptionality, that's not identified, that's not, and so on. And different parents get different experiences. It's ridiculous because there's a duty to accommodate all students with disabilities, regardless of what their disability is. So it's and the final problem is when you got a school board that's a system, and this isn't just Toronto, this is province-wide, which is why we've taken the message to the province, that's operating under these handcuffs that make it harder for teachers and principals to serve all learners, it makes things worse. So we got to take off the handcuffs. So how do you do that? Well, I can tell you the coalition I lead, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance, we've been pushing since 2009 for the provincial government to pass a new regulation to tear down the recurring barriers that impede students with disabilities in our school system. So how are we doing? Well, we've never gotten that regulation, but we got the government to agree 8 years ago to develop the regulation. We got the government to appoint an expert committee to recommend what it should include. I had the privilege and the honor of being on that committee. It was made equally up of disability sector experts and education sector experts. Had a long name, the Kindergarten to Grade 12 Education Standards Development Committee. We rendered a comprehensive report over 2 years ago. And unfortunately, the provincial government has done nothing to enact the regulation that we recommended.
That's unfortunate, but it does give you something to focus on during your term as SEAC.
Oh, absolutely.
And your advocacy work. We'll have to leave it there, David. I know we could chat for another half an hour or so, but thanks for taking the time this afternoon. Thanks for your leadership and advocacy, and thanks for agreeing to come on as the SEAC chair again. Really look forward to supporting you in that role and having a productive term for you in that chair role.
Thanks very much. And let me just make a quick plug. If anybody watching would like
Sure.
to learn more about this advocacy work, you can sign up to get email updates from the AODA Alliance. I'll give you the link, but I'm going to say it too. You just go to www.aodaalliance.org, aodaalliance.org. Right on the homepage, that you click on the sign up link, put in your email address, and you'll get our updates. It'll give you lots of tips on how to help.
Perfect. I'm on the list. It's well worth the inbox notifications that come with it. Thanks for your time, David. We'll chat again soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much for including me.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you for your time, David. It is inspiring to hear about our advocacy efforts, and we are confident that this information and resources will help families and friends become more aware of their rights and continue to advocate for inclusion. As we come to an end, my sincerest thanks to everyone watching our webinar today and to our presenters. It was a pleasure to have you with us today. And a special thank you again to David for taking the time to join us for an insightful chat. Our next Family and Friends update will be hosted live on March 25th, so please do watch out for the registration information. Thank you and have a great afternoon, everyone.